They said they didn't have the money. But a week later, I saw them post photos from Paris, champagne in hand, smiling under the Eiffel Tower. Meanwhile, my grandson lay in a hospital bed in Greenville, his tiny hands clutching the blanket de V lines running down his small arm. I sat beside him, listening to the steady flicker of the heart monitor, thinking about the days when I was still young enough to believe that family was where people found kindness. My name is Henry Dalton. I'm 64 years old, and this is the story of how karma found its way back home. Before I tell you what I did, tell me, where are you watching from? And make sure to subscribe so more people can hear this story. I live alone in an oakwood house on the edge of Greenville, South Carolina, a house I built with my own hands, one plank, one nail at a time, over 20 years of working as a structural engineer. After I retired, I opened a small carpentry shop, crafting pews for Riverside Baptist Church and desks for the local elementary school. My wife Margaret passed away from cancer in 2014. Since that day, the house has been the last thing left of the world I built, with her a relic of laughter now echoing with quiet. That house smells of oak and pine resin, the scent of time itself. Every morning when sunlight spills through the east-facing window, it catches the rippled grains of wood on the walls like memory carved into grain. I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the hum of trucks along Highway 276, and I think about my two children. Matthew, 40, runs a real estate firm in Charlotte, Dalton Realty. He dresses well, speaks with precision, and talks about million-dollar projects like they're proof of existence. Profit is his language. Anna, 35, is the opposite. A school teacher here in Greenville, gentle, grounded, always smiling when she talks about her students or her 5-year-old son, Jacob. She calls often, sends pictures of him learning to draw counting numbers or chasing the dog around the yard. I never said it out loud, but Anna was the last thread that kept me feeling like a father. Matthew. He's polite, distant, the kind of man who calls on birthdays and Christmas to fulfill a social duty. I stopped blaming him. I just stopped expecting. Last winter, Anna started coughing. She said it was just a cold, but the pale tint on her skin didn't fade. One Saturday I visited. She was sitting in the living room looking exhausted, but trying to smile. Jacob ran to hug my leg, laughing while she told me not to worry, she just needed rest. I wanted to believe her, but the tremor in her hands told me otherwise. A week later, the phone rang. It was Anna. Her voice was weaker. She asked me to come to Duke Medical Center. I drove 2 hours through heavy rain. When I arrived, she was in a hospital bed, her skin paper white under the fluorescent light. The doctor, a gray-haired man with a steady, indifferent tone, invited me into his office. He told me Anna had lupus, an autoimmune disease that makes the body attack itself. He talked about medication treatments, percentages of recovery. I sat still, staring out the window, where the wind brushed against bare trees, and heard nothing except the heavy thump of my own heart. When I walked back into the room, Anna reached for my hand. Her fingers were thin cold. She said she'd be fine, that she needed to go back to school soon, because Jacob needed her. I nodded. We both knew it wasn't true. But sometimes people lie to keep love alive. From that day on, I lived in 2 places, the hospital and the house. Mornings were for getting Jacob to school. Afternoons for sitting by Anna's bedside. Nights for cleaning the shop, drinking coffee, waiting for calls that never brought comfort. Some nights I'd sit by the window, staring at the reflection of the streetlight on the glass, wondering when I stopped being young enough to fix things. Jacob would wake Pad into the room, crawl into my lap, and ask when his mother was coming home. I said soon, without daring to meet his eyes. Her illness moved faster than anyone predicted. By February, she was back in the hospital with pneumonia. I brought Jacob with me that morning carrying comic books and a crayon box. He sat beside her bed drawing a picture of his mother, his grandfather, and our Oakwood house under a bright yellow sun. Anna looked at it, tears rolling down her cheeks, and whispered, "Dad, I want to go home." I asked the doctor if she could. He shook his head. I understood. 3 days later, I sat beside her listening to the heart monitor flatten into silence. It was a soft sound, like a breath being taken away forever. The funeral was held on a cold morning. Jacob stood beside me in a tiny gray suit holding my hand. He didn't cry. He just watched the casket being lowered and asked if his mother was going to sleep for a long time. I told him she was dreaming of a place full of sunlight and lavender. He nodded quietly. After the funeral, I brought him home. The Oakwood house suddenly felt too large, too hollow. In the mornings, I'd hear him calling Grandpa from the other room, voice still thick with sleep. At night, I read him stories in the same chair where his mother used to sit, letting my voice fill the space she left behind. A week later, I filed for legal guardianship. The court approved it faster than I expected, maybe because there was no one else left to do it. Every day I saw glimpses of Anna in him, the way he lined up his pencils, before drawing the way he smiled more with his eyes than his mouth. But sometimes when he grew quiet, I saw something else. A small, unspoken ache I couldn't name because to name it would make it real. Then one morning in April, while I was making coffee, Jacob came into the kitchen, pale and trembling. He said he felt dizzy. I rushed him to Greenville Memorial. The doctor ran some tests, then told me we had to transfer him to Duke. Hours later, I sat again in that same sterile waiting room. The cardiologist, Dr. Helena Price, explained that Jacob had a congenital heart defect. There was an experimental procedure that could save him, but it wasn't covered by insurance. The cost was $85,000 due within 3 months. I nodded. I heard her words, but all I really heard was time slipping through my hands. That night, I drove home in silence. The kitchen light flickered when I turned it on. I sat at the table, the hospital paperwork spread before me. Then my eyes drifted to Margaret's photo on the wall. She once told me that no home is worth more than the lives inside it. I took the frame down, placed it on the table. The wood beneath my hand felt cold, smooth, final. I opened my phone and scrolled through old contacts until I found a name I hadn't seen in years, Rebecca Monroe. Margaret's friend, a retired real estate lawyer. The phone rang once, twice. I drew in a breath and waited. I didn't know what I'd say first, but I knew what had to be done. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, carrying the faint scent of old wood and rain. I looked around the house and listened to the floorboards creak beneath my feet. And I knew I was about to step into the next chapter of a life that had already lost too much. The kind of chapter where a man stops fearing what he might lose because everything worth keeping now beats inside his chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, the lamp casting soft light across the worn oak boards, listening to the wind scrape against the porch roof. The house breathed with me, old, tired, and heavy. I'd lived here for nearly 30 years. Every plank knew my life, my wife's laughter, and the echoes of everyone I had ever loved and lost. Now I was about to sell it. The thought cut like a dull knife, slow but deep. The next morning, I drove to downtown Greenville to see Rebecca Monroe. She hadn't changed much since I last saw her, small frame, short silver hair, sharp eyes that missed nothing. When I told her I wanted to sell the house, she just looked at me for a long moment before nodding. She asked if I was sure. I told her that some decisions, if you hesitate, life won't wait for you to fix them later. She didn't press. She just pulled a file from her drawer and told me to bring the property documents that afternoon. I thanked her and stepped outside. The sunlight cut through the trees, warm and harsh on my face. When I got home, Jacob was asleep on the sofa. His cheeks were pale, his breathing shallow. I laid my hand on his forehead. It was cold. Every time I looked at that boy, I saw Anna. I remembered her hand gripping mine at Duke, her voice fading as she whispered that Jacob would need me more than I thought. I didn't understand then. Now I did. A week later, I took him back to Duke Medical Center. The hallways glowed white under the fluorescent lights, the air thick with antiseptic. Dr. Helena Price met me in her office. Her voice was calm but firm. She said Jacob's heart was weakening faster than expected, that regular treatment no longer worked. There was a newly approved experimental procedure, she said. Promising. High success rate. But because it was still in trial, insurance wouldn't cover a cent. The total cost, $85,000 payable within 3 months. I sat there listening, but the words floated past me like static. $85,000. For a retired man living off savings and a woodshop. It wasn't just a number, it was a wall. I asked if there was another way. She shook her head, eyes soft, apologetic. I nodded, thanked her, and stepped into the hallway. On the drive home, rain slicked the streets, the world a blur of reflections. The radio played a Willie Nelson song, his voice raspy, weary, carrying the ache of someone who'd lost too much but kept on driving anyway. I thought about Matthew, my son. The man with 2 homes, a company of his own, a new car every year, and an investment portfolio he once bragged about over Christmas dinner. If anyone could help, it was him. I stopped the truck in the parking lot outside Dalton Realty in Charlotte. The building was all glass and polished, the company logo gleaming at the entrance. I walked inside, told the receptionist I was Matthew Dalton's father. She smiled politely and made a call upstairs. 5 minutes later, Matthew appeared, dark blue suit, perfect tie, a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Dad, you should have called first," he said, voice smooth, professional. "I needed to talk in person," I replied. "It's important." We went into his office. I told him about Jacob, about the doctor, about the surgery and the cost. He sat still, tapping his fingers lightly against the desk. When I finished, he took a long breath and said he'd review the budget, the way a man talks about adjusting a project, not saving a life. I nodded, because begging didn't suit either of us. 2 days later, the phone rang. It wasn't Matthew. It was Alyssa, his wife. Her tone was soft polished, the kind of softness people use when they're used to saying no. She said they'd discussed it carefully, and unfortunately, they couldn't help. They had already paid for their European trip, $300,000, fully booked, and non-refundable. "Everyone has their own life, Henry," she said. "I hope you understand." I didn't speak. For a few seconds, I only heard my own breathing and the faint sound of children laughing somewhere outside the window. Then I said quietly that having a life of your own doesn't mean forgetting the people who gave it to you. She didn't reply, just wished me luck and hung up. That night I sat on the porch, the air cool, the trees whispering. The scent of pine and resin drifted toward me, sharp and familiar. It carried me back to the years I spent on construction sites, years I believed that if a man lived with decency, his children would learn it by example. Now I knew better, not everyone learns what kindness looks like. I called Rebecca and asked about the sale. She said there was interest, a young couple from Colombia looking for a house outside the city. She asked if I was sure I wanted to move that fast. I told her if I waited, the boy wouldn't have time left to wait with me. She was silent for a moment, then said she'd arrange a viewing within the week. Later that night, I walked into Jacob's room. He was asleep, clutching a small plastic dinosaur in his hand. Every time I saw him like that, my chest tightened as if something inside was being twisted too hard. I sat at the edge of the bed and whispered that everything would be all right, that Grandpa would find a way. He couldn't hear me, but maybe I needed to hear it myself. When the house fell quiet, I went out to the workshop behind the house. I flipped on the yellow light and picked up the saw. The blade hummed, slicing through a board. Sawdust floated in the air like smoke, the smell of fresh-cut wood stinging my eyes. I worked as if the rhythm itself could hold me together, cut sand, breathe anything, to keep from thinking about what was coming. On the workbench sat an unfinished wooden clock I'd been making for the church. The hands hadn't been attached yet. I stared at it, remembering the years I taught Matthew to measure, to hammer, to build with patience. He used to say, carpentry made your hands rough, while investment made a man refined. I told him once that refinement had nothing to do with the collar you wore. That line feels hollow now. I went to bed late. Rain drummed lightly on the roof. In the dark, I replayed Alyssa's words in my mind. Everyone has their own life. I thought about how people use that phrase. What they mean isn't life, it's heart. A heart big enough for ambition, for fine dinners and polished photos, but too small to hold love that doesn't serve them anymore. I don't know if they'll ever feel regret. But I know one thing for certain, I don't have time to wait for it. Tomorrow morning, I'll sign the papers. Because some things, if you don't do them now, you'll never have the chance to do again. I woke to the pale light seeping through the curtains, soft and hesitant, like it was afraid to touch the room. The air was damp, thick with the scent of oak and rain-soaked earth. The house held its breath, still suspended in the kind of silence that has weight. Only the wall clock moved, ticking steady and slow, each beat measuring the distance between hope and what was left of it. On the table, the hospital papers waited like a quiet verdict. I poured a cup of coffee and sat down. The steam rose and vanished as I unfolded each page. My eyes stopped on the red letters printed across the top, not covered, experimental treatment. I read the words again and again. Each time they grew heavier, like they were carved deeper into the paper. They didn't change. They never do. $85,000. A number that could fit on a single line, but in my world, it was a mountain that no amount of climbing could conquer. I picked up the phone. First the local bank, then the insurance office, then a half-dozen medical foundations whose numbers I found online. Each call began with the same tone, professional, polite, safely distant. A young man apologized before telling me that at my age, credit was a complicated matter. Another suggested an emergency loan program at an interest rate that would bleed me dry before Jacob ever had the chance to breathe freely again. Finally, I called the state retirement office. I told them I needed to withdraw early, that it was for my grandson's surgery. The woman on the other end listened without interruption, and when I finished, she said I could pull the funds if I was willing to lose 40% to penalties and forfeit my health care for life. I asked her quietly, if it were your son, would you do it? There was a silence, then a click. The call was over. I stared at the pile of paper in front of me. The insurance policy I once believed would protect my family sat on top, the edges curled, the ink faded. The room felt too large all of a sudden, as if the house itself had stepped away from me. The floorboards groaned under the weight of years, each creak a reminder that time was moving faster than I could. I leaned back, eyes drifting toward the ceiling. The morning light came through the skylight and spread thinly across the beams, a halo dissolving into dust. Around noon, I heard tires on gravel. Matthew's car. He came in pressed shirt, gray tie. the faint smell of cologne that didn't belong in this old house. His phone was still in his hand. He said he had a meeting soon, could only stay for a few minutes. I nodded, motioned toward the chair across from me. When his eyes landed on the pile of hospital bills, his jaw tightened. "You're really doing this?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He gave a short laugh, dry measured. "You don't have to sell the house, Dad. There are options. Reverse mortgage, medical assistance funds, crowdfunding. And if those aren't enough," I asked. He blinked like the question didn't make sense. I looked straight at him. "If Jacob were your son, what would you do?" He didn't answer. His hand twitched slightly, resting on the arm of the chair. Outside, the sunlight was sliding through the pines, breaking into thin shards on the window glass. The clock ticked in the silence between us, a sound so small it filled the whole room. I asked again, softer this time. "If it were your child," he turned away, his voice steady, calculated. "This isn't a simple situation. You're letting emotion cloud your judgment." I said nothing. He stood, adjusted his tie, and spoke like he was reciting something memorized. "I just want you to stay calm and not make any decisions you'll regret." He placed a hand on my shoulder, then stepped back. "I've got to head out. Meeting at 3. I walked him to the door. He paused before leaving, said, "Please don't do anything rash." I watched him cross the yard, the sun glinting off the hood of his silver car. For a moment, his reflection flickered in the rearview mirror, and then he was gone. The sound of his engine faded into the wind, into the distant caw of a crow somewhere beyond the roofline. I stood there until the air turned cold. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the words he said, or the silence that followed. Sometimes a man's silence weighs more than his refusal. Back inside, the papers were still there, waiting. Numbers stacked on numbers, looping in my head like a cruel melody. One page had fallen to the floor. I bent to pick it up and saw the small print at the bottom: payment due within 90 days. 90 days. But Jacob didn't have 90. Maybe 6 weeks if Grace was still watching. By evening, I sat on the porch. The chair beneath me creaked, the wood silvered by years of rain and sun. Long shadows from the pines reached across the steps. I thought about the first day Margaret and I laid the foundation of this house. 2 young hands, cracked and calloused, building something we thought would last forever. This place had seen everything. Anna chasing fireflies, Matthew learning to drive. The night I sat beside Margaret's bed and listened to her breathing fade like a song ending too soon. Every plank in these walls held a piece of our story, but now it needed to hold Jacob's future instead. I went inside, opened the drawer, and pulled out the deed. The paper was yellowed corners, curled edges, soft as fabric. Rebecca had already prepared the sale contract. I read every line slowly, then picked up the pen. The ink trembled a little in my hand, but landed firm. Signing my name felt like lowering a casket and planting a seed at the same time, burying a piece of myself to keep something else alive. When it was done, I walked the house once more. Every room, every corner whispered something. In the kitchen, the floral curtains Margaret had sewn were still there, faded but intact. On the mantel, Anna's graduation photo smiled at me from a time when everything still felt possible. I turned off the lights, leaving only the faint glow from the hallway. Outside, the wind stirred again, moving through the pines, carrying the scent of resin and wet soil. I sat back on the porch, watching night fall, slow and patient. Every gust of wind sounded like a reminder that life, no matter how cruel, never stops moving forward. I will sell the Oakwood house. Not because I want to, but because I must. Because some choices, if not made now, will vanish forever. And because somewhere beyond these walls, a small heart is waiting to beat again, in a world where love, I still believe, means everything. I met Rebecca Monroe on a Monday morning. Her office was tucked inside an old red brick building downtown, the front glass fogged by early dew. Rebecca came out to greet me, a small woman with cropped silver hair, and that same quick, alert gaze she'd had years ago when I was still an engineer, and she handled the legal contracts for our firm. She looked at me for a long moment, before asking quietly if I was sure. I nodded. We sat across from each other at her desk. The light from the window drifted across the stack of papers between us, pale and moving like water. Rebecca turned each page, slowly explaining the transfer taxes, the closing fees, the escrow period. Her voice was calm, deliberate, precise. I listened, but half my mind stayed back in the Oakwood house where the hum of the saw, the thud of the hammer, and the scent of fresh timber had been my rhythm for 30 years. When I finished signing the power of attorney, Rebecca laid a hand gently on my shoulder. She said she'd try to close within 2 weeks. I asked if she'd ever had to sell a place she'd spent her life in. She smiled faintly and said, "If you live long enough, Henry, you end up giving something away." That sentence followed me out the door and stayed in my head all the way home, soft, steady, undeniable. That afternoon, I listed the house. I chose a photograph from a summer long gone, the porch wrapped in green pine sunlight, spilling over the honey-colored roof. My description was simple, almost spare 3-bedroom Oakwood home, Greenville, built and maintained by owner. When I clicked post, the confirmation chime sounded cheerful, almost triumphant. I felt nothing but an ache in the quiet that came after. The next day, the phone rang. A young woman's voice, bright, nervous, said she and her husband were looking for their first home outside the city. They came that weekend. I stood on the porch as they walked the yard, pointing and smiling, their fingers intertwined. The woman said the house felt like family. I watched them, and for a moment saw myself and Margaret all over again, 2 dreamers in work boots building a future with our hands. When they drove away, I knew they'd be back. 3 weeks later, Rebecca called. They signed, she said. 200,000. The number meant nothing. It wasn't relief. It was arithmetic, cold, exact, detached from the years it measured. I asked when the signing would be. Friday, she said. I thanked her and sat in silence, listening to the wind moving over the roof, like a tide coming in. The morning of the closing, I woke before dawn. The first light slid through the pines and laid itself across the porch. I walked from room to room, my hand brushing the walls, memorizing every scuff, every echo. On the mantel, our wedding photo still stood, Margaret smiling in a white dress. I didn't take it. I couldn't. A house shouldn't be left completely empty. It needs to hold on to a soul, even if it's not mine anymore. Before I left, I tried calling Matthew. Once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. I wanted to tell him I'd sold the house, that I didn't need his pity, that a man has to know when enough is enough. But when the tone beeped, all I said was, "Jacob's surgery is scheduled." Then I hung up. That afternoon, Rebecca arranged the signing at the notary's office. I arrived early wearing a white shirt and my old gray slacks. The buyers, a young couple with wide, eager smiles, shook my hand and said they'd take good care of the house. I nodded, smiled back, and signed my name on the last line. The ink flowed steady, the letters firm. When the pen left the paper, it felt like my entire life had just ended, with a small, quiet period. Rebecca stood, said everything was finalized. I thanked her, took the check. Outside sunlight glanced off the marble steps, and that's when I saw Pastor Raymond Cole waiting by the porch. Gray cardigan, wide-brimmed hat, his presence as familiar as Sunday itself. I wasn't surprised Raymond had married Margaret, and me had brought pie and prayer to our doorstep every Christmas since. He came forward, took my hand in both of his. I heard he said, voice rough as gravel. I nodded. He looked straight into my eyes. Maybe the Lord doesn't take from us, Henry. Maybe he just trades what we don't need anymore so we can keep what we can't live without. I didn't answer. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry leaves and the distant chime of the church bell. I looked down at the check in my hand. The sunlight caught it, made it shimmer $200,000. Enough to save a small, fragile heart. Enough to begin again, though I was far too old for beginnings. I thanked Raymond and started walking. Each step on the brick walkway sounded like the slow closing of a door behind me. That evening, I went back to the house one last time. Moonlight poured through the window, laying my shadow across the floor. I packed Jacob's few belongings, took down the family photo, and looked around. There was nothing left worth taking, only memories hanging in the air, like dust that refuses to settle. I stood in the middle of the living room, palm pressed to the wall, feeling the coolness of it seep into my skin. I had sold the Oakwood house, but I kept the part of me that still remembered how to love. That night, I drove out to a small cabin on the edge of town, one Raymond had found for me. It was old, but clean, with a sloped roof facing the pines. I unlocked the door, set my bag down, and listened to the floorboards sigh beneath my boots. There wasn't much inside: a single bed, a wooden table, and a window that opened toward the sunrise. I brewed a cup of coffee, sat down, and watched the last of the twilight fade. The silence felt different here, not empty, but waiting. In the morning, I would drive to Duke Medical Center with that check in my hand. Jacob would have the chance his mother never did, and for the first time in years, I would have kept a promise, not to the world, not even to God, but to my daughter. The next morning, I drove to Duke Medical Center. The road was still wet from the night's rain, the mist low and silver over the fields. I held the check in my hand, the paper slightly damp from sweat, the ink still sharp and blue. When I stepped into the billing office, a young woman behind the counter greeted me with a polite smile. I set the check down gently and told her it covered the full cost of my grandson's surgery. She looked at me first with surprise, then something softer, like respect. She promised to forward the information to Dr. Price immediately. I nodded, thanked her, and walked back out into the morning air. The hospital behind me loomed gray and steady, like a place that knew too many goodbyes. By afternoon, I was back in the small cabin on the edge of town, unpacking what little I had brought from the Oakwood house. Every item carried a story. The dining table I'd built for Margaret. Anna's graduation photo, her smile wide and alive, frozen in a summer that would never return. Jacob's wooden toys, worn smooth from small hands and time. I placed them neatly on the shelves one by one until the cabin began to feel less like a shelter and more like a beginning. The smell of pine lingered on my hands as I wiped dust from the table. That's when the phone rang. It was Irene Wallace, my old neighbor from Greenville. "Henry," she said, her voice thin with hesitation. "Have you been online lately?" I told her no. I didn't have much use for the internet. She sighed. "Then you probably haven't seen what everyone in town's talking about. It's Matthew and Alyssa." I paused, said nothing. "They just posted a travel vlog," she continued. "European Luxury Getaway 2024. Italy, France, the Maldives. It's all in there. The captions are full of things like, 'You only live once.'" I didn't speak for a long while. Irene went on how the video was sponsored by Matthew's real estate firm and a European partner, how the estimated cost was around $310,000. "People recognized you," she said softly. "They know you're his father." I sat down, staring out the window at the pines swaying in the wind. "Did you watch the whole thing?" I asked. She said yes, then hesitated. "There's a part where Alyssa lifts a glass of champagne on a yacht. She says, 'You only live once, so live it fully.'" I felt a smile pull at my mouth, faint and dry. "Some people," I said, "live once and forget that others are just trying to live one more time." When I hung up, the room was quiet again. The coffee on the table had gone cold, the steam long gone. I turned on the old radio. A country song came through the static, slow and hollow, like someone dragging their sorrow across the strings of a guitar. I wasn't angry, not really. But inside me there was an emptiness that didn't have a name. A part of me wanted to believe Matthew didn't know that maybe the video was just business. But another part, the one that still knew him as a boy, understood it was no accident. For them, life had become a stage, and money was the light that kept the performance alive. By evening, I stepped outside. The sky had turned a soft amber, the color of fading fire. The pines stretched long shadows across the dirt road. I thought of Anna, of how she once said Matthew took after me more than I realized. She might have been right. The difference was, whatever part of him resembled me had long been buried under balance sheets and boardrooms. I watched the sun slip behind the horizon and wondered if people ever notice when they start losing their humanity, or if it happens so quietly they only realize it when it's too late to turn back. 2 days later, Dr. Helena Price called. Her voice was low but steady, the kind people use when they've rehearsed the words too many times. She said the new test results were in. I heard her shuffle the papers, a pause, and then a silence that told me what was coming before she spoke. "Jacob's heart is failing faster than expected," she said. "If the surgery isn't done within 8 weeks, it won't hold." My hand tightened around the phone. For a second, it felt like something inside me cracked open. I asked if it could be sooner. She said they were working to move the schedule up, but the team needed more time to prepare. I told her I'd take care of everything. Just give him the chance. When the call ended, the sky outside had turned to rain. The cabin glowed under a single yellow bulb. The roof ticked softly with each drop. I sat there thinking about the distance between this small, creaking cabin and the oceanfront hotels where my son was probably sipping wine. That distance wasn't measured in miles, it was measured in lives. I thought of Matthew as a boy, barefoot in the backyard, handing me nails while I hammered wood, asking why people worked so hard. I'd told him because the world doesn't hold itself up unless someone's willing to. Now I wondered if he'd ever understood, or if he'd forgotten before he even grew up. I walked into Jacob's room. The boy was asleep, his breathing shallow, every inhale ending in a faint rasp. I sat by his bed, took his small hand in mine. It felt so fragile, I was afraid my grip might break it. I whispered that I'd sold the house, paid for the surgery, and that all he had to do now was hold on a little longer. His eyes fluttered open halfway. He smiled, weak but clear, and asked if we'd go home soon. "Yes," I said. "Anywhere you are, that's home." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the rain streak down the glass, the streetlight outside stretching into long ribbons across the puddle. 2 worlds lived inside my mind. One where a boy slept beneath the hum of hospital machines, and another where a champagne glass shimmered against a golden sea. Both belonged to the same family. Both existed in the same moment. When morning came, I brewed coffee and watched the first light break across the fields. The wind carried the scent of wet pine. I knew then these next 8 weeks would be the edge between life and loss. I had nothing left to lose but that child. And I realized that sometimes God doesn't test a man through pain, but through the quiet horror of watching his own blood forget how to care. I called Rebecca Monroe just as the sun lifted over the pines. She confirmed she'd received all the documents and said she'd witnessed the transfer herself. I sat at the wooden table in my cabin, opened my old laptop, and logged into the bank. The numbers on the screen glowed cold and precise, indifferent, like a scale that weighed everything except the weight of a man's heart. I took a deep breath, entered the amount typed in Duke Medical Center, and wrote in the note line, Pediatric Cardiac Surgery, Jacob Hale. The phone rang again. Rebecca's voice came through steady as always. She'd verified everything with the bank. The funds would clear within the day, and confirmation would be sent directly to the hospital. I thanked her, then just sat there listening to my heartbeat echo inside my chest, like the soft knock of a hammer against raw wood. By noon, the billing department called. They confirmed receipt of the full $85,000 and said Dr. Price had been notified. I hung up and stared at my hands on the table. The same hands that had built a house were now holding open the door for a child's heart to keep beating. I didn't feel pride, only a strange release, like setting down a heavy plank after carrying it too long. 2 days later, I drove Jacob back to Duke Medical Center. The sky over Durham was white and thin, the light dissolving on the hospital's glass facade. They led us to the pediatric cardiac wing. Dr. Helena Price met me in the waiting area. Her eyes were bright focused, but carried that exhaustion of someone who lives on the narrow edge between loss and mercy. She walked me through the procedure again, duration risks, contingencies. I listened as if I were gripping the end of a rope, and on the other side hung the rest of my life. When they wheeled Jacob's bed forward, he reached for me, his fingers small, cool as river water. I bent close, told him I'd be right there, that he only needed to close his eyes for a little while, and when he woke it would all be over. He nodded faintly, and the nurse pushed him through the automatic doors. The glass slid shut, catching my reflection. An old man standing alone like a smudge of ink trapped between worlds. The waiting room was too quiet, the kind of silence that hums. A painting of a lake hung on the wall, its soft blues trying too hard to soothe. I sat down, fingers locked together, listening to the hum of the vents, the shuffle of nurses passing by. Every 10 minutes felt like a lifetime unspooling in slow motion. I tried reading a magazine, but the words scattered before they made sense. I stood, poured a cup of water, and drank in small sips to hide the tremor in my hand. The smell of antiseptic brought back the night Anna left this world. I pressed my palms together, closed my eyes, not to ask for anything specific, just to whisper to whatever might be listening. Keep him here. Please. A nurse stepped out, said the operation had begun. I nodded and sat back down. Time lost its shape. I heard footsteps, gurney wheels rolling across the floor, the faint crackle of the vending machine. Then somewhere deep in my mind, the rhythm of a hammer echoed the sound of my old workshop, steady grounding. I didn't know why it came back now, only that it kept me from falling apart. When the doors finally opened, Dr. Price emerged. Her cap was off her hair, damp with sweat. Her eyes carried fatigue, but also light. I recognized it before she even spoke. The surgery was successful, she said. The words hit like air after too long underwater. My chest tightened, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. She explained how they'd repaired the valve, stabilized the blood flow, how his heart was responding well. I don't remember what I said in return. My hand reached for the chair beside me, cold metal against warm skin, something solid to hold. They let me look through the glass window of the recovery room. Jacob lay still, pale, a white bandage across his chest. The monitor beside him blinked in steady rhythm, each beep a soft hammer strike on new wood measured alive. I pressed my forehead to the glass and exhaled slowly. In that moment, it felt as if the last storm of my life had finally moved on. That evening, I went back to the cabin, hung my coat by the door, sat by the small stove until the warmth began to fill the room. The phone buzzed once. A text from Matthew glad he's okay. Nothing more. I turned the phone face down and didn't reply. The days that followed blurred into gentle routines. Short visits. Long hours waiting for Jacob to wake fully. I'd arrive early, sit by his bed reading children's books out loud, just to fill the air with sound. The first time he opened his eyes, I told him the beeping monitor was his new drum one built just for him. He smiled faintly, eyes still hazy, and drifted back to sleep. Dr. Price came in later, checked the charts, nodded. She said recovery would take time, but the outcome was everything they'd hoped for. I thanked her, and for the first time since the day Anna died, I reached for someone's hand and held it tight. She smiled, told me to take care of myself, too. The road after she said is still long. When Jacob grew stronger, he said he wanted to go home. I told him anywhere he was, that was home. The cabin, small and plain, somehow became warm. I built a little bookshelf from leftover oak, placed it beside his bed, and stacked his comic books on the top shelf. The kitchen smelled of chicken soup I'd made too salty, but he grinned and said it tasted like his mom's. I turned away, pretending to look for a spoon so the heat behind my eyes could fade quietly. On Sunday evening, Pastor Raymond stopped by with a basket from the Riverside Church women's group. He sat in the old chair, looked at Jacob's pink cheeks, then at me. He didn't give a sermon. He just said there'd be a small fundraiser next week for another boy in Spartanburg waiting for heart surgery. What do they need? I asked. He said, everything. I went to the small safe, pulled out the remaining envelope after the medical and travel costs, and placed it on the table. I told him I wanted to start something called Anna's Hope through the church's community fund to help other children hear the steady hammer beat of their own monitors someday. Raymond was silent for a long moment, then nodded. I'll take care of the paperwork, he said quietly. Later that night, I stepped into the small workshop behind the cabin. The smell of pine sap and sawdust wrapped around me like an old friend. I sawed, sanded, and painted until my hands stopped shaking. When it dried, a wooden sign gleamed softly in the lamplight, Anna's Hope carved by hand. I hung it on the wall across from Jacob's bed, where he could see his mother's name each morning. It looked like a bridge between two lives, hers and his, held together by love and grain and faith. When night came, Jacob slept soundly. I sat on the porch alone. The scent of damp pine drifted up from the ground. Crickets pulsed in rhythm. I thought of the old oakwood house, of the sound of saws and hammers that had shaped my life, of every door that had closed only to reveal another. The anger was gone. What remained was quiet peace, the kind that comes when a man finally accepts his small corner of the world and decides to hold it up steady and gentle for as long as he can. I leaned back, eyes tracing the dark sky. Somewhere beyond the silence, I could still hear it, the soft beeping of Jacob's heart monitor. It sounded just like a hammer striking new wood. Rhythmic. Alive. And for the first time in a very long while, I believed again. Sunday morning, the Riverside church bells rang longer than usual, slow, resonant, like they were reaching for something beyond sound. I sat in the last pew beside Jacob. He wore a gray wool hat. His face was still pale, but his eyes were clear again, alive in a way I hadn't seen for months. Pastor Raymond stood at the pulpit. His voice, low, steady, and kind, carried through the vaulted room as he told a story about a man who had sold his home to save his grandson's life. I listened, not realizing he was talking about me, not until he mentioned the pines in Greenville and the carpenter's hands that kept a promise. The church fell silent. Only the faint breathing of children and the thin light filtering through the stained glass moved. It cast gold across Raymond's white robe like paint over water. He ended the sermon with a line that caught somewhere deep in my chest. "Compassion doesn't need miracles," he said. "It only needs someone to choose what's right when no one is watching." When the service ended, people came to shake my hand. None of them said much. Just quiet nods, warm palms, and the kind of stillness that says more than words. I held each handshake, felt the living heat of it, real, human, simple. That afternoon, Irene Wallace knocked on my cabin door. She carried a basket of waffles and her phone, the screen glowing bright. Someone from the church had filmed Raymond's sermon and posted it on Greenville Church online. I asked why. She said, "Just to share something good." Then she hesitated. "It's spreading faster than anyone expected." She played the video for me. Raymond's voice filled the small room. The camera panned across the silent congregation, then down to the pew where Jacob and I sat. The caption beneath the post read, "Henry Dalton, the grandfather who sold his home to save a life. Over 100 shares in just a few hours. And climbing." 2 days later, the phone rang again. A woman's voice, quick, polite, but gentle. "My name is Claire Benton," she said. "I'm with the Greenville Post. We'd like to feature your story. People in town can't stop talking about it." I hesitated. Told her I wasn't used to being in newspapers. "I understand," she said. "But this isn't about attention. It's about reminding people that kindness still has a place." There was a pause. Then I said yes. The next morning, she came to the cabin, a woman in her mid-30s, hair tied back, wearing an olive knit coat. She carried a small recorder and a notebook. She looked around, the cabin, smiled faintly, and said it reminded her of her grandfather's house. We sat at the wooden table. Jacob played quietly in the corner. She asked about the house I sold, how I made that choice, what it felt like. I told her the truth, plain and steady, like a man telling his life to another person on a windy afternoon. She asked if I wanted to use my real name. I said yes. If people are going to write it, I told her they might as well write it right. I've got nothing to hide. She asked if I was worried about attention, about being misunderstood. I smiled. I've been forgotten a lot longer than I've ever been misunderstood, I said. If this story makes someone look at their own family differently, then that's enough. Before she left, she handed me a consent form so the paper could use my name and photo. I signed it. My handwriting trembled, but the line was clean. 4 days later, the article ran on the front page of the Greenville Post. The headline read, "The Man Who Sold His Home to Save His Grandson." Beneath it was a photo of me standing in front of the cabin, thick coat hand resting on Jacob's shoulder. The story told the whole arc, Anna's passing the house I built, the sale that bought another heartbeat. Claire didn't write it with pity. She wrote it with stillness, with pauses where readers could breathe. She let my words sit inside the story, like nails inside wood, quiet, essential. I didn't realize how far it had spread until the calls began, neighbors, church members, strangers. Some offered prayers. Some shared their own stories. Some just said thank you. It felt strange, loud almost. I'd never known kindness could echo like that. But maybe silence needs a sound now and then to remind people it's still there. Jacob read the first few lines of the article, mouthing the words carefully. Then he looked up at me and asked, "Why do people care about us, Grandpa?" I said. Maybe because they see something they want to believe that if one person can choose love, maybe someone else will too. He smiled softly. Then Mom would be happy. I turned away before answering because the words wouldn't come out right. That evening, Pastor Raymond came by the newspaper, folded neatly in his hand. He said it had been shared on several community pages in Charlotte, where Matthew lived. He didn't say anything more. He didn't have to. I took the paper, looked at the headline again. In the photo, Jacob and I stood before the cabin, the pines behind us swaying like quiet witnesses. No lights, no stage, just an old man and a boy who'd survived. And somehow that was enough to make people stop scrolling. When night fell, I opened the door and sat on the porch. The wind carried the scent of dry leaves. Somewhere in the distance, the church bells rang again, steady calm like a heartbeat learning to trust itself. I didn't know where all this would lead. But I knew one thing for certain, that the things born from silence, if honest enough, can travel farther than anything ever shouted into the world. 3 days later, Iran Wallace called. Her voice was low, hesitant. She said there was big news about Matthew on the Charlotte evening broadcast. I turned on the old television in the cabin. The image flickered in and out, but the headline was clear enough, bright red across the bottom of the screen: Charlotte developer faces ethics and accounting probe. I sat there in silence, the sound of the reporter's calm, clinical tone cutting through the static like a blade. She spoke about an emergency shareholders meeting at Dalton Development Group, my son's company. Words like misconduct, financial irregularities, and ethical concerns fell one by one, each heavier than the last. They said that after the Greenville Post article, the man who sold his home to save his grandson went viral. Investors began to question the character of the company's leadership. An anonymous shareholder had reportedly asked how a man could lead others if his own father had to sell his home to save a child, while he and his wife were touring Europe on a $300,000 luxury vacation. I felt the sweat gather in my palms. Then came the footage. Matthew stepping out of his office building surrounded by flashing cameras and shouted questions. His face was pale, his eyes darting away from the light. Someone called out, "Is it true your father sold his house to pay for your nephew's surgery while you were in Italy?" He didn't answer. He turned his head and kept walking, jaw tight, shoulders drawn inward. For a moment the camera caught him just right, long enough for me to see not the man he'd become, but the boy who once stood in my workshop at 15, laughing proud of the first chair he ever built with his own hands. I muted the TV, watching his silent image fade under the cold studio light. Then I switched it off completely. The cabin fell quiet again, save for the wind slipping through the doorframe. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel revenge. Just a strange, steady stillness, as if life itself was repeating a lesson I'd once tried to teach, but this time in a voice too loud for him to ignore. I had told him long ago that money could build a house, but it couldn't hold a home together. Now the world was teaching him that same truth with the kind of authority only consequence can carry. The next afternoon, the newspapers filled with details. The company's CFO, Nathan Briggs, was under investigation for falsifying revenue reports and using private investment funds to cover project losses. When pressed by reporters, he hinted that all transactions had been approved by executive leadership. "Do you mean Matthew Dalton?" someone asked. Nathan just smiled faintly. "I'll let the authorities decide." That night, the national networks picked up the story. The headline burned across the screen: "Luxury developer under ethics fire." The broadcast cut between shots of Dalton Group's shuttered offices and the same vacation footage of Alyssa still floating around online, the champagne glass, the yacht, her voice saying, "You only live once." Matthew laughing beside her. The comments scrolled faster than I could read. His father saved a life. He saved his image. This isn't a financial scandal. It's a moral one. Some fortunes cost too much soul. The next morning, Irene called again. Her tone carried both pity and discomfort. She said Alyssa's fashion sponsor had pulled her campaign and a cosmetics company had terminated their partnership. Everyone in Greenville's watching the news, she said. I thanked her, but told her I didn't want to hear any more. Outside, the morning was brittle and gray. The light fell thinly through the pines, catching the mist like silver threads. I brewed coffee and sat on the porch. Jacob came out clutching his coloring book, his small hands stained with crayon dust. Grandpa, he asked, why is the TV talking about Uncle Matthew? I waited before answering. Because some people have to learn again what they once forgot. He nodded slowly, then went back to coloring his strokes, careful, deliberate, quiet. I watched him for a long time. In his small, steady focus, there was something pure, untouched by all the noise adults invent for themselves. That evening, Pastor Raymond came by. He took off his hat, sat down across from me, and said nothing for a while. The fire cracked softly between us. Did you see the news? I asked. He nodded. Sometimes God doesn't punish, he said. He just lets people see their reflection. I understood. No one needed to destroy Matthew. The world was doing that all on its own. 2 weeks later, Dalton Development Group filed for bankruptcy protection. I read it in the Charlotte Business Journal. The list of creditors was long. Projects frozen. Offices emptied. A photograph showed the company's glass tower with a faded sign taped to the doors, closed for audit. Alyssa had become the tabloid's new fascination. They called her the Queen of Empty Glamour. Matthew hadn't been seen in public for days. That night, I sat in front of the TV again. The news anchor closed the report with the same tone they use for obituaries measured final. She said the Dalton Group, once a symbol of rapid growth in Charlotte's skyline, had become a cautionary tale about ambition and compassion, what happens when one outruns the other. I turned off the TV and stood by the window. The cabin smelled faintly of oak and cold air. The curtain moved slightly in the wind. I didn't feel triumph, and I didn't feel sorrow. Only the quiet certainty that the world had finally delivered the lesson I'd tried to give my son years ago, that value cannot be bought. Money can build roads and towers. It can pave a city and polish a name. But it can't buy rest, it can't buy peace. And when a man forgets that life patient and unyielding will find a way to remind him. I turned off the lamp, letting the room dissolve into the dim wash of moonlight. Across the cabin, Jacob slept soundly, his breathing even and calm. I sat beside him, listening to the wind through the pines. Sometimes justice doesn't need a hand to guide it. It only needs time. 3 quiet months passed, months filled with the hush of pines and the steady rhythm of recovery, where the sound of the heart monitor had faded into something like memory. One rainy night, as I was folding Jacob's blanket, 3 knocks struck the cabin door, sharp, deliberate, and impatient. I opened it. The cold wind rushed in. Matthew stood on the porch, soaked and hollow-eyed, his coat wrinkled and his face drawn thin. He looked like a man who'd walked through a long, dry desert and run out of water halfway. His lips cracked as he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. He said the house in Charlotte was being repossessed. The bank had issued the notice. He'd tried negotiating, but it was too late. If he could come up with $95,000, he might still save it. I stood there, the rain blowing between us, carrying that raw smell of pine and iron. My mind did the math before my heart could interfere. After Jacob's medical bills, prescriptions, and settling into the cabin, I still had about $100,000 left, money I'd kept for emergencies. the kind that arrive without warning. Matthew looked down at his shoes, twisting a cheap wool hat between his fingers, like he could wring the shame out of it. He said the auction date was set, the lawyers were out of options, and he just needed that amount to hold off the sale. "I'll pay it back," he added, his voice trembling on the word back. I stepped aside and gestured for him to come in. Jacob was asleep in the next room, his breathing soft and even. I poured Matthew a glass of water. His hand shook so badly that the rim of the glass tapped against the table. I asked if he'd spoken to Alyssa. He nodded faintly, said the sponsorships were gone, the accounts frozen, everything falling apart. I asked if there was anyone left to borrow from. He shook his head. Former investors weren't answering calls. Partners had walked away. The bank only communicated through letters now. Rain hit the roof in a steady, cold rhythm. I could hear my own heartbeat matching it, slow, deliberate. I told Matthew I understood the bank, the deadlines, the feeling of standing against a wall that keeps closing in. But I also told him I couldn't decide tonight. He nodded like a man receiving a postponed sentence. At the door before leaving, he said he'd wait for my call whenever it came. The porch light cast a thin shadow behind him. He turned, almost said something, then stopped. The old car coughed to life, its headlights bleeding red across the wet gravel before vanishing into the trees. I stood under the eaves for a long time, letting the rain touch my sleeves. Inside, Jacob stirred and murmured "Grandpa" in his sleep. I closed the door, sat down at the table, and opened my worn ledger. The pages were soft at the edges, smudged with pencil. There it was, my remaining balance, the notes for cabin repairs. 100,000. If I gave away 95, I'd have 5,000 left, enough for groceries, gas, for the hospital visits, a few months of air to breathe. The rest I'd have to earn with labor and faith. That night, I didn't sleep. I brewed a weak cup of coffee and paced between the window and the table. I remembered the last time Matthew came here, the way he told me to be realistic. I remembered him as a boy, hammering nails crooked and looking up at me, waiting for my nod. I remembered the video lights of Paris, Alyssa's voice saying, "You only live once." The memories didn't clash anymore. They just aligned clean and cold into the shape of a truth I could no longer unsee, the distance between two shores of the same bloodline. At sunrise, I called Rebecca Monroe. Her voice was steady, crisp as ever. I told her Matthew had come, that he needed money to stop the bank, that I wanted to help, but not by throwing cash into the dark and waking up misunderstood. I told her I wanted a legal, transparent agreement. Witnesses. A bank transfer, not an envelope. I didn't want anyone someday saying this was revenge disguised as mercy. She paused, then said, "Come to the office this afternoon. I'll draft something simple. Clear terms, clear intent, clear consent." I thanked her and hung up. Jacob woke as I was fixing breakfast. He ate oatmeal with strawberries, eyes curious. "What's wrong, Grandpa?" "You keep staring out the window." I smiled faintly. "Someone got lost," I said. "He's trying to find his way back." Jacob thought about it for a second. "When people get lost," he said, "they should ask someone kind." I nodded. "And when they do, they should listen to the answer." Later that morning, I drove Jacob to Irene's house so she could watch him for a few hours. The road was wet fog hanging low over the fields. Irene met us at the door, wrapped Jacob in a hug, told him he could watch cartoons in the living room. She handed me a tin of cookies and said, "Sugar helps with hard choices." Rebecca's office looked the same as always, a small space window facing a row of old maples. She had the papers ready on her desk. "There are 2 documents," she said. "One is a no-interest loan agreement, formal, witnessed with repayment terms, a clause for early payment, and full disclosure that this is a voluntary act of goodwill. The transfer goes through the bank. No cash, no ambiguity. She tapped the second folder. This one is optional. It's a handwritten acknowledgement, something Matthew can sign admitting to certain moral truths about the choices that led him here. It's not punishment. It's protection for the truth when memory starts bending to comfort. The air in the room thickened. I told her I wouldn't humiliate my son. I didn't want this money to become a trap or a weapon. Rebecca nodded. Then we'll do it clean, she said softly. She scribbled a note at the bottom margin, witnessed signing notarized full transparency of transfer. Bring him tomorrow afternoon, she added. We'll finalize everything. Before leaving, I asked, do you think I'm doing the right thing? She looked at me for a moment, then said, sometimes right and wrong don't stand on opposite sides. Sometimes they live inside the same person, and that person has to find the balance. By dusk, the cabin smelled of fresh wood and rain. I opened the drawer, pulled out the checkbook, and laid it beside the envelope with Matthew's bank details. I printed the bank's foreclosure notice and clipped it on top. In the margin of my notebook, I wrote 3 words, steady, honest, clear. That night, I placed the folder inside my old leather case and checked it twice. The rain had stopped. The forest outside hummed with crickets, a soft, endless soundtrack. I stood by the door looking into the darkness beyond the porch light and told myself what I'd say in the morning. Call Matthew. Tell him to be on time. Dress properly. Speak plainly. Sign what needs signing. Read what needs reading. Then I closed the door, turned off the light, and rested my hand on the case. The cool, smooth surface grounded me like touching a piece of wood I'd sanded long ago, knowing it would have to bear the weight of something important once more. The next morning broke cold and damp, the kind of air that carried silence in it. A thin layer of fog had settled on the windshield, white as breath against glass. I rose before dawn, brewed coffee, and placed the folder already packed, already decided into my worn leather bag. Jacob was still asleep, curled like a question beneath his blanket. I left a note for Irene asking her to take him to school. Before stepping out, I paused. The first light of morning pushed through the fog, thin and silver, landing on the framed photograph of Anna that still stood on the shelf. I touched the edge of the frame softly, as though any harder would wake the ghosts that lingered in the wood, then closed the door behind me. The road to Rebecca Monroe's office was barely 10 miles, but it felt longer that morning, like traveling through memory instead of distance. When I arrived 15 minutes early, Rebecca was already there. Her desk was immaculate, her pen aligned with the folder corners, her presence calm as a still lake. 2 stacks of papers waited in the center of the table, one for the bank, one for the signing. She looked at me, eyes steady. Are you sure you want to go through with this? I nodded. When a man has already chosen his road, stopping halfway only means forgetting where he meant to go. 10 minutes later, the door opened. Matthew walked in, Alyssa just behind him. They both looked diminished, haunted by nights without sleep. Alyssa wore sunglasses, though the red around her eyes showed through. Matthew avoided my gaze, unbuttoned his coat, and sat down across from me. The room smelled faintly of paper and coffee gone cold. Rebecca began the formalities. Her tone was clinical, but not unkind. This is a legal and transparent transaction, she said. Witnessed, notarized, and binding. She opened the folder, slid a page across the table. I began reading aloud, my voice slow, level, deliberate. I, Matthew Dalton, acknowledge that I once had the means to help my father save my nephew's life and chose not to. I accept the amount of $95,000 as a voluntary loan, and I agree to remain truthful about the past, with no further contact after repayment. The silence afterward was heavier than the words. Matthew's hand clenched around the pen, but didn't move. Rebecca spoke gently. You have the right to review, revise, or refuse. But if you sign, every clause becomes enforceable by law. Alyssa rested her hand on his arm, whispered something I couldn't hear. He didn't answer. The light through the window fell across the table, pale and narrow like a blade. Even the ticking of the clock seemed to disappear. Finally, Matthew looked up. His voice was hoarse, almost breaking. I don't have another choice, he said. Then he signed. The pen scraped against the paper, dry, final, echoing in the stillness, like a nail driven into wood. Alyssa broke into tears, covering her face with both hands. I watched them not with anger, but with a kind of exhaustion that comes only after every other emotion has burned itself out. When the notary stamped the document, Rebecca gave a small nod. I took out my checkbook. My handwriting was slow, deliberate. $95,000. I signed it, tore the check from the book, and placed it inside the sealed envelope. Rebecca double-checked the account number and called the bank. When she confirmed the transfer had gone through, I exhaled long and steady, like the room had finally taken its first breath. Matthew stared at the receipt, then looked at me. This money, I said quietly, doesn't buy back what's been lost. It's just a reminder that some debts can't be paid with money, only with truth. He lowered his head. His shoulders trembled, maybe with shame, maybe with something softer. Alyssa reached for his hand, crying silently. I stood, slipped my copy of the agreement into my coat. It ends here, I said. Rebecca nodded, but her eyes carried something like sorrow. Matthew started to speak, but I stopped him with a small gesture. Keep the house, I said. And if you can learn again what it means to live inside one without losing your soul. Outside, the afternoon sun pushed through the thinning clouds. The pavement still glistened from the night's rain, and the air smelled of wet earth. I stood there for a while, listening to the hum of distant traffic. In my pocket, the agreement and the bank receipt pressed lightly against each other, one bound by law, the other by memory. When I returned to the cabin that evening, Jacob was playing checkers with Irene. She looked up when I came in. All done, she asked. Yes, I said. It's done. She studied me for a moment. Do you feel lighter? I thought about it. Maybe. But it's the kind of light that comes from setting a stone deep into a river so something else can stand on it. She didn't ask more. When she left, I sat at the table, turned on the small lamp, and pulled the notarized envelope from my pocket. I opened it. Matthew's signature sat there in black ink, each letter trembling, but clear. I took another copy of the document, folded it carefully, and slipped it into a fresh envelope. On the front, I wrote Claire Benton, the Greenville Post. I thought of her article, the way she'd written it, without drama or accusation, just truth, plain and steady, like the sound of a hammer meeting honest wood. If someone once told the beginning of this story, I thought they deserved to know how it ended. At dawn the next morning, I went to the post office. The clerk, familiar by now, smiled. Another one for the paper, just an update, I said. I signed the insured mail slip, pressed the stamp onto the envelope, and watched it slide across the counter onto the scale. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote a few quiet lines. I didn't seek revenge. I only adjusted the balance. Because when the weight stays too long on one side, even the world forgets what level means. And when justice arrives late, sometimes it needs a hand to set the scale right again. I closed the book, turned off the light. In the dark, the wind moved through the pines, soft and even. It sounded for the first time in a long while like the breathing of a world that had finally found its balance again. Morning in Greenville opened clear and cold, the kind of light that feels freshly washed. I brewed my coffee and cracked the window, letting in a slow current of air that smelled of pine and dew. A knock came at the door, 3 soft taps. It was Irene, a newspaper folded beneath her arm. "You might want to see this," she said, setting it on the table. The Greenville Post spread open across the wood, the headline printed in bold, "A Father's Forgiveness Comes with Silence," by Claire Benton. Published that morning. I read every line slowly, as if the paper itself might bruise under my fingers. It began, "Some men choose revenge. Others choose justice through silence." Claire told the story of a father who once sold his home to save his grandson's life, who later helped the very son who had betrayed him not out of affection, but from a belief that compassion only means something when it endures in gratitude. She never mentioned Matthew by name, calling him a well-known developer in Charlotte. The article ended with a sentence I had never spoken aloud, but she must have seen it in my eyes that day. Some debts are settled not by revenge, but by remembering what mercy feels like. Irene read beside me, her breath soft, then sighed. "They're sharing it everywhere," she said. "People are calling you the man who rebuilt morality." I smiled faintly. "If morality needs a man's name to stand again," I said, "then maybe the world's weaker than we thought." She laughed, resting a hand on my shoulder. "Maybe so. But sometimes even a house that still stands needs one good beam to keep it level." That afternoon, I went into town for groceries. At the counter, the shopkeeper showed me his phone. The story had spread online, my photo sitting at the old wooden table taken from Claire's article. Comments filled the screen. Some said they wanted to donate to the Anna's Hope Fund. Some said they cried reading it. Others said they'd call their fathers after years of silence. I told the shopkeeper I don't want anyone crying. I just want people to remember how to listen. 2 weeks later, a friend from Charlotte called. He said Matthew and Alyssa had left the city, sold the last house, moved somewhere near Asheville. Nobody knew exactly what they did now, but a neighbor had mentioned a small farm, vegetables, a few sheep, maybe peace. Nathan Briggs, the former CFO, was under investigation for fraud. I didn't feel vindicated, or even sorry. It just felt balanced. Like the world after a long storm was finally letting the water find its way back to the riverbed. I kept working at Riverside Church, teaching woodworking to the weekend kids, most without fathers, some from the shelter nearby. They loved the scent of pine and the hiss of the plane across a clean board. I taught them to measure twice, to hold the chisel steady, to look for the shape hidden inside the wood before cutting. It was the same lesson I once taught Anna. Sometimes when one of the boys smiled at a piece of work finally done right, I saw her there again, in their laughter, in the sawdust, in the light that came through the workshop window. The Anna's Hope Fund had grown too. What began with a few donations from the congregation had become a community program. Every year, Riverside raised money for children with heart conditions across nearby states. Pastor Raymond liked to say the fund didn't just save children, it saved adults who'd forgotten how to believe. I always smiled and said, I don't save anyone. I just kept a promise to someone who's gone. Evenings came gentle in Greenville. I'd sit behind the church listening to the kids play in the yard, the laughter scattering through the late light. Sunlight filtered through the trees, gold and weightless. In my notebook, I wrote, maybe forgiveness isn't about forgetting. Maybe it's about looking back and no longer wanting to punish. Maybe justice isn't about seeing the guilty fall, but about seeing the good still standing. I closed the notebook, set it down. The wood beneath my hand was warm. Before dusk, I stepped out onto the porch. Pastor Raymond was walking by. He lifted a hand. "Evening, Henry. There's a Thanksgiving service tonight. Think you could say a few words?" I smiled. "If I speak," I said, "I'll talk about bridges." "Bridges. The ones between people," I said. "Between mistakes and forgiveness." He chuckled. "That's a sermon worth hearing." That night back at the cabin, I lit the small lamp and looked out through the window. The fields were still. Moonlight lay flat across the grass, silver, like a carpenter's plank. Jacob was asleep, his face soft and peaceful. I thought about Anna, about those who'd left and those who'd stayed, about the oak house that no longer belonged to me now. Someone else's laughter echoed under that roof. I didn't know if the world was truly fair, but I knew this much: sometimes fairness comes not as triumph, but as quiet. And when I looked at my grandson in the morning sun, I understood, at least in this small corner of life, everything had found its rightful place again. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and listened to the wind moving across the cabin roof, soft, rhythmic, like a whispered thank you from somewhere far beyond reach. The sunlight in Greenville was clear as lake water, mirroring the pale blue sky. I sat on the porch of the cabin, a cup of cold coffee in my hand, listening to the sound of a ball rolling across the grass. Jacob was painting with the neighbor kids, his body quick, full of light, his hair wild under the sun, his laughter carrying all the way to the tree line. I watched him, and for the first time in a long while I realized I wasn't afraid of losing anything anymore. I had lost a house. I had lost a family. I had lost my faith in people. But I still had something no one could buy back: the beating heart of a child who carried my blood. A heart that had once stopped and found its way back to life through love. The wind moved through the pines, bringing the scent of old wood and resin. I heard a car stop at the gate. Pastor Raymond stepped out, a worn Bible under one arm and a basket of freshly picked apples in the other. He smiled as he walked toward me, his linen shirt soft and frayed at the collar, the kind of white that had known many summers. "Henry," he said, "you didn't just save a life. You saved the faith of those who'd forgotten what kindness even looks like." I smiled. "I'm no hero, Pastor. I'm just a carpenter who couldn't stand to see another roof collapse under the weight of selfishness." He studied me quietly, then nodded. "Sometimes," he said, "the same hands that swing a hammer are the ones that keep the world standing." I asked him if he ever felt tired preaching faith in a world that seemed to have misplaced it. He chuckled. "Faith's a lot like wood. It only weakens when people forget to tend it with fire and with time." When he left, I walked him out to the gate. Before getting into his truck, he turned and said, "Henry, I think Anna and Margaret must be proud of you." I watched him disappear down the dirt road, the hum of his engine fading into the pines. The cabin felt alive again when I stepped back in, like it was breathing with me. Light fell through the window, landing on the table where an old photograph rested beside a yellowed newspaper. I looked at the headline again. "A father's forgiveness comes with silence." I brushed the edge of the page, hearing it whisper softly under my hand. Maybe Claire Benton never knew what her story had done for me, that it made me finally face the man in the mirror after years of looking away. I wiped the dust from the picture frame. Margaret was smiling, gentle and sure, and Anna stood beside her, holding a bouquet of lavender. "You're home now, aren't you?" I whispered. I opened the drawer, took out my notebook, and wrote a single line. "Some homes are built with wood, others are built with love, and those, they never fall." I closed the notebook, placed it beside the photo, and stood up. Outside, the evening light stretched long over the field. Jacob's shadow trailed behind him on the grass, blending with the gold of sunset. like a quiet promise that goodness still had soil to grow in. If someone were to ask me now, after all these years, whether I hold any bitterness, I would say no. What I hold is gratitude because I finally learned how to rebuild a home not with bricks or oak beams, but with the unseen things only a heart can understand. If you've stayed with me till now, thank you. And if this story made you believe that compassion is the highest form of justice, share it. If you believe kindness still deserves a place in this world, leave a like. And if you want to keep hearing stories about people, about family, about homes built from love, subscribe. Because sometimes a single home built with kindness is enough to keep the world from falling apart. And if you've lost your way, remember you can still begin again so long as you still believe in love. I looked up at the wide sky, the sunset folding itself over the trees like a soft blanket, and I whispered, I'm home now.